This next question is about talking to sellers. What do I say to a seller who has any objection? And this is a pretty good rule of thumb. Any objection that somebody makes, it always goes back to, what are your options? What are your options? Because what they want to do and what they're able to do are usually two very different things. It's like if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you got cancer, I'm really sorry to give you that news. And you could say to the doctor, no, I don't want cancer. But the doctor will say, well, you got cancer, so you got to deal with it in a way that a solution that will actually work. You've got three options. You got chemo, you've got surgery, we've got radiation. Which one makes the most sense to you? Here are the good and bad parts of each one of those things. And then you have to choose one of those bad options in order to survive. And you have to pay the doctor a fortune in order to survive. And you're going to thank that doctor when it's all said and done, if you survive, and say, I really appreciate you doing this for me. You saved my life. Even though it cost me a fortune, I lost my house, and I lost my whatever piece of your body got cut off. So these things, they don't always want to do what we are suggesting. But what we're suggesting is usually their best option. And if you can figure out what their options are, that's going to make your life easier. Now, the way to figure out what their options are is to understand what the zero-down hierarchy is, the structures, and what's possible there. But it's also, if you go into the auto marketer, there's a button on the lead sheet that says Seller Options. And if you click it, it'll show up all the options. List it with a realtor. Here are the pros, here are the cons, here's how long it typically takes, here's how much it costs to do that. Or you can sell it on a short sale. Here's what happens in a short sale. Here's what happens to your credit. Here's what happens with the bank. Here's when you can get your next property. Here are the pros. Here are the cons. You can get rid of the property. You can stay there for a while, maybe without paying anything. What if you sold it at a dramatically below market value? Here are the pros for that. Here's the cons for that. What if you sold it subject to? What if you sold it multi-mortgage? What if you sold it on a land contract or contract for deed? What if you sold it for cash? What if you sold it on a lease option? You have all these different options, and you can tell them the options that you're personally willing to do, plus the other options they have that you can't do. Because when you do that, it builds your credibility. So, you could list it with a realtor. Does it make sense? You've got equity here. It could make sense for you to list it with a realtor. A realtor is going to cost you, 6-7% for their realtor fee. It's going to cost you another 2% for closing costs. It's going to cost you maybe 3% for negotiation costs. It's going to cost you another 2% for, repairs on the property. So you're looking at, somewhere between 7 and 15% in cost to sell your property. Also, in addition to that, it's going to take you, on average, in this market, 75 days to get the property sold if you list it right at the beginning. But 1/3 of all properties that go on the market, don't sell. They become expired listings, so you'd have to leave it on longer or lower your price, so you make it even less because you have to lower your price if you didn't price it right the first time. And that's all going to be determined not by you or your realtor, but by the buyer, because the buyer determines the price, and then, of course, it's got to appraise. And so now you got to get into the loan if they do buy it. So it's got to appraise, they've got to qualify for the loan. Typically it takes 45 days to close a loan with a lender these days, and a lot of times they fall apart because of inspections, because of appraisals, because of the credit of the buyer. So you've got a lot of headaches dealing with a realtor. But you cash out of the deal, and you get a lot less cash because it goes all different directions. But it might be the best way. Would it make more sense, though, if you wanted to make more money, to do a lease option, for example? Here's how a lease option works. And you can give them the pros and cons of that, and maybe sell them on the idea of doing the for-rent method, and you can go and flip that property, make yourself a quick $5,000 or $10,000, and get them a full-price buyer that pays full market rent for that property, and really solve their problem. If you do that and you show them their options, they're much more willing to pick from a list of options than they are to do what you tell them to do. All right, hope that helps. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck.